Valentino from Epsom. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to speak here and members of the committee. I believe I do have some new information to add, and I also believe I may have some clarifying information to add, and I also think I have some things that just need to be said. If there are any parts of this brief statement that I'd like to read that you've heard before, I'll just apologize in advance.
Just before we start,
Sure.
if you have printed copies, and you can provide that to our clerk so that he doesn't have to type in every.
Yes, I've got extra copies. I'd like to start by saying that I don't stand to gain a nickel whether Senate Bill 180 passes or not. If just one public official had simply been held accountable in any way, then I wouldn't have come here today. The FRM scandal has been a stain on our state government. Scandal and government seem to go hand in hand these days, and sadly, so does apathy. More and more people are getting fed up with the scandals that come out of Washington on an almost daily basis, but don't know what to do about it. Maybe by focusing closer to home, the average person can make a difference by helping to weed out the corrupt or incompetent before they make it to Washington. We've had wars on drugs, poverty, and now terrorism, but never a war on corruption, abuse of power, or ignorance. Not illiteracy, but ignorance to what really goes on in the darker corners of government and bureaucracy. It means being informed and exposing corruption and abuse of power wherever you see it, regardless of political party or any other affiliation to those involved. Not one single IRS employee spoke out about the illegal targeting of citizens based on their political beliefs, and not one person has been held accountable. I'd like you to join me by declaring your own personal war on corruption. Supporting Senate Bill 180 would provide some restitution to the hundreds of victims around the country who are financially destroyed as a direct result of the corruption and/or negligence of some New Hampshire state officials. Every state has its own FRM story, and more than a few politicians on the national stage could be traced to one. Typically, these scandals get swept under the rug and the players move upward and onward. You have a chance to make a statement and stand up for justice. I've heard that some of the members of this committee want to know more about the victims of this tragedy and are under the misperception that they're somehow Wall Street big shots who invested in a Ponzi scheme and are looking for a bailout. FRM wasn't a Ponzi scheme. SB 180 certainly isn't a bailout, and the numerous victims that I've met certainly aren't Wall Street big shots. Not that their financial status any more than their race, religion, sexual orientation, or anything else about them should matter one bit with regard to seeing justice served. It's a shame that people aren't as curious about the people that victimized them. Who are these victims? They're the people next door who worked in the factories, the people who designed and built things, the people who paid their taxes, fought our wars, saved to put their kids through school and put money into their 401ks, the people who have pursued the American dream and who have been pulling the wagon, only to have the rug pulled out from under them, many who were in retirement. They're not like the person I saw on television during Hurricane Katrina who said, "No one's telling us where to go, no one's telling us what to do." No, these are the people who would have found a way to walk north until they were dry. They never looked to the government for anything. These are the people who contributed to this country through their blood, sweat, and tears under the false impression that people in government had that same ethic. Another misperception or lie that is still being propagated about the FRM victims is that they were quote-unquote investors in the mortgage brokerage firm FRM. The investors in FRM didn't lose a penny. They were the stockholders in FRM, people like the banking commissioner's brothers. Those investors were the people holding several $1 million of worthless stock over a decade ago due to the insolvency of FRM. The true financial status of FRM was only known to the employees of the New Hampshire Banking Department, and they knew a lot. Yet FRM was allowed to stay in business long enough for the FRM investors to get all of their money back at the expense of the FRM lenders. The cost of that included 2 suicides, numerous divorces, lost homes, depression, illness, relocation, loss of income, welfare, and elderly citizens as old as 87 returning to work. According to the Chandler report, no amount of due diligence could have uncovered anything negative about FRM. The only people in a position to know the truth were state officials, and not only did they withhold that truth, but misled the public with false information. Loans brokered through FRM were secured by real estate. Liens and the names of the lenders were recorded in the various counties, as is standard practice. The company, CL&N, serviced those loans by dispersing the funds to the borrowers and collecting the monthly payments on behalf of the lenders. Undistributed funds were held in the CL&M escrow account. This is also standard practice. What isn't standard practice is for $20 million of that escrow account to be stolen through an illegal line of credit extended to Scott Farah, president of FRM, by Don Dodge, president of CL&M. This was outright theft, and both men are now in federal prison. It also isn't standard practice for the banking department to knowingly allow a company like CL&M to operate without a license, nor to allow both of these companies to operate without fidelity bond coverage, which is required by law in order to protect victims against losses from criminal acts of officers of an institution. If just that one law had been enforced, the victims would have had recourse and wouldn't be here today. You spend a lot of time and effort writing these laws. How does it feel to have them ignored by public officials to the detriment of your constituents? Upon the final collapse of FRM in November 2009, the banking commissioner claimed the FRM lenders were now stockholders in FRM and referred all matters to the New Hampshire Securities Bureau. Mark Connolly, the director, later wrote a book called Cover Up, which describes some of the lengths that people went to in order to cover their tracks. The banking commissioner was allowed to retire with full benefits not long after publicly declaring that he had dirt on the governor. Despite the fact that the Attorney General's office received several criminal complaints against FRM, no actions were taken. The Attorney General later testified that the buck never made it to her desk, and she's now a U.S. Senator. The Director of Consumer Protection for the Attorney General's office was appointed to conduct the investigation into his own and his agency's behavior, and conveniently left out all of the relevant sordid details. He also pointed an accusatory finger at the Securities Bureau in an effort to minimize and spread load any responsibility or blame. He was later nominated by the governor to be the Deputy Attorney General. To date, there's been no criminal investigation despite numerous questionable relationships, to include ties between Scott Farah, the banking commissioner, and one of the largest law firms in the state. In a move that essentially wiped their hands of anything to do with FRM, the Attorney General's office passed the buck to the federal government by forcing FRM into Chapter 7 bankruptcy instead of state receivership where it belonged. This single act caused far more damage to the FRM victims than anything that Scott Farah and Don Dodge did. A bankruptcy trustee, who was simply a private lawyer, was appointed to liquidate the estates of FRM and CL&M. Both companies had virtually no assets. 2 weeks after the FRM collapse, at a private meeting between the AG's office, the banking department, and the bankruptcy trustee, all three concluded that the victims were stockholders or investors in FRM, and therefore the mortgages held by these lenders were securities and now somehow assets of the estate. Surprisingly, no one from the Securities Bureau was invited to the meeting. More surprising is the fact that the AG's office paid a private law firm $75,000 of taxpayer money to reach the same conclusion without looking at any of the loan documents. A bankruptcy judge later ruled that these were in fact privately owned mortgages, unfortunately not before costing victims millions through coerced settlements with the trustee. By claiming that the mortgages were securities, the trustee seized all properties and mortgages that had ever been brokered by FRM as now being part of the estate. Since the trustee is paid by the estate to liquidate it, this was a very profitable decision for him. All of the victims were sued by the trustee for not only the mortgages they held, but also any money they had ever received as a result of any previous loans going back 4 years. If a lender made a $100,000 loan and that loan was paid off and the $100,000 was then rolled over into another loan, the trustee would not only sue for the existing loan and the property securing it, but would also sue the victim for an additional $100,000 for the old loan, as well as for any payments received on those loans. Standard practice was to offer victims 50% of the net proceeds after auctioning off the properties at fire sale prices. Since the trustee did not take any ownership responsibilities for the properties other than claiming them as part of the estate, property taxes with late fees mounted and properties that had been under construction deteriorated as they sat vacant for years. Many victims settled under duress as they saw their equity evaporating and their legal expenses rising. Although perfectly legal, and despite the appearance of impropriety, the trustee hired his own small law firm, whose partners include his wife and a former mayor who is now a sitting alderman. All of them are paid over $300 an hour from the estate, and the trustee getting an additional 3% of the gross that they bring in. To date, they have received over $2.5 million for themselves. Most of the victims had to give up their claims to the estate as part of their settlement agreements. Those who didn't are expected to receive 3 cents on the dollar, if that. This is a complicated case with each victim having different circumstances, but the long and short of it is that the trustee's main legal arguments got shot down in court one by one over the years through the efforts of one couple who spent over 6 figures in legal bills. Just prior to going to trial to resolve the final counts, the trustee settled with them by essentially allowing them to keep everything he was suing them for. It would seem that the risk of losing at trial wasn't worth it. Had the trustee lost, it would have shown that he fleeced hundreds of people out of millions of dollars with no legal basis and made a lot of money while doing it. The irony is that instead of helping the victims, the state recently put in claims against the FRM estate for over $200,000, money that will come directly from victims. The claim includes charges for auditing FRM after the collapse, fines for the first time, back taxes with penalties. These claims have already been approved by the trustee and the bankruptcy court. The horrendous treatment that the victims received at the hands of the trustee was described as a quote-unquote unintended consequence by the Attorney General's office. Passing SB 180 will send a message to every state worker and politician that there are unintended consequences for the state too, and that people are watching. This bill is about government accepting responsibility for its actions. Your support will inspire hope that maybe government can be held accountable, at least at the local level, which is where everything starts. I'd like to leave you with a quote from Frank Serpico, who said, "The fight for justice against corruption is never easy. It never has been and never will be. It exacts a toll on ourselves, our families, our friends, and especially our children. In the end, I believe, as in my case, the price we pay is well worth holding on to our dignity." Let's all hang on to our dignity and do the right thing.